Welcome to the fourth video on strategy in general, morale factors. I'm just going to preempt this reading with just a little observation, because I sort of briefly read it and was thinking about morale factors, and in particular my own personal perception on morale and how it would affect things. And I was just sort of thinking of my own personal existence as an analogy, and actually saw morale in a completely different light. And this was just yesterday, actually. And I've always used morale in the sense that I'm about to sort of discuss, but almost without the clear insight that I sort of felt yesterday about it. If you watch the videos, essentially I do have morale in these games. Just looking at a completely random map here, but this unit, well, once the game is started, let's say maybe even go into the game mode, this unit has depressions 0. And he has no depressions. You can see that it doesn't say depression. It doesn't say depression 0, because he hasn't been attacked. Now, if I was to attack this or that, or the depressions would go up. And I've often I called it depressions deliberately right from the very start because of the relation to depression. And I get the feeling that a lot of modern game designers, they don't really want to sort of get people thinking about what morale really entails, in regards to the spirit of things, and the psychological well-being of a person in combat, and they prefer to push it down to what is a common concept in modern games that I've seen on YouTube and the like, are called step losses. A step loss represents the number of losses, but also to some extent the effect on morale, etc., etc. Now, I don't want to say that is how they do morale, and what I'm saying is they quite often sidestep morale factors in many instances, and try to call them things that don't really represent morale. Whereas I think that my use of the word depression is actually, from my point of view, to some extent more key to what it's all about. But I've always been uncertain, so I'll call them intermittently depression, disruption, dispersion. Lots of words beginning with D. Disruption, depression. There's another one. It's not dispersions, but anyway. And I was thinking, what's the difference between how I feel in one instance and how I feel in another? And I think it's as simple as that. If you're feeling really good, and I know this is probably not a mind blower to a lot of people, but I was just thinking about it, and this is what came to me yesterday. If I was feeling really good, I could probably do things that I wouldn't ordinarily do if I was depressed. And this is key to how I perceive morale as a scalable discipline, in the sense that you can look at it in the light of your own life, and the things that are affecting you or would work against you in your life, things that might upset you and cause you to become depressed. And you can almost see then, in a nutshell, sort of why people would try to make you depressed, because then once you're in a depressed state, you're less likely to achieve success or to achieve the objectives that you might have for yourself. So, if you had an enemy, for example, in the real world, let's say it was a business competitor or someone that was competing for, the same love of your life, or someone that was trying to compete athletically or in college or school or whatever. If they were to do something to make you depressed, then you would be less likely to maybe take a chance on something that you might have been about to do. For example, thinking, right, now's the time, I'm really going to go out and I'm going to do this. I'm really going to sit down and I'm going to write this bit of work, this song, or I'm going to go out and really have a crack at meeting some people, and these sorts of things are all based on morale, and I call them depression factors. So when the units are fresh, they feel like doing things, But I was sort of thinking, how that works with leadership, and now that's slightly different because I was considering, the implications of leadership, and basically it's sort of you sort of think, well, why would people be almost fanatical in the way that they would engage in war, charging, across the trenches in the First World War. What would it be to raise their spirits so much that they really stopped looking at the potential for loss and just went for it? And other things that can affect morale are things like camaraderie. Knowing that your comrades have died, and knowing that there's nothing you can do more than put yourself on the line, in the same way. And I think this sort of elements of psychology are probably quite deep and involved. I'm not going to go any more into that. I just wanted to sort of touch on the fact that I had a little eureka moment on sort of considering being in exactly the same situation, and this is what I consider does in exactly the same situation where you're faced against adversity. And the actual incident I was thinking about was you in the street and someone is causing a fight. If you were highly motivated, you might say, yeah, come on, and really jump into the fight. But if you were incredibly depressed, you might say, well, just sort of try and get away and go home. And the situation would be exactly the same. You're physically as strong, you're the same person, the situation is exactly the same, it's just you're depressed, or you're exceptionally high on life and motivated. And this is sort of, this just looking at the title morale factors, those are the thoughts I came up with. So I'm going to start reading it anyway. So the first bit is just a reference to the other book. So we must return once more to this subject already touched upon in Chapter 3 of Book 2, which we haven't got, since the morale elements are among the most important in war. So he's saying they're the most important. Okay? They constitute the spirit that permeates war as a whole, and at an early stage they establish a close affinity with the will that moves and leads the whole mass of force, practically merging with it, since the will is itself a moral quantity. Unfortunately, they will not yield to academic wisdom. They cannot be classified or counted. They have to be seen or felt. And that's interesting because he's using morale in this sense as a greater morale, the morale of the force, of the army. And I think that that's actually quite a separate morale to the morale of the individual, but I think it's exactly the same thing. They're just scaled differently. If there's an air of dejection in your unit or in your battalion or your company, that will affect personal morale. But essentially, so I think it's safe to say that they're both the same thing. But it's interesting that he's clearly defining it as a greater quantity, although he says it can be classified or counted. But I think, from my point of view, in my mind's eye, there it brings to mind some of the comments that I read on the Iran-Iraq war. Essentially, I don't know which one it is. I'm not really going to try and say it's this one. I'm not really going to try and say a quote exactly, but from memory that there was some Iranians. I think it might have been this one where they basically assaulted the Iraqi lines and they lost thousands. I mean, how much does it say they lost here? 70,000. There's one of these where they lost thousands, and I made a note of it in the notes. So I don't think it's Kormashar. I don't think so. It doesn't matter. But I can't see anything about thousands being lost. No, it's not that one. I don't think it's that one. Operation NASA. No, I don't know where it is. It's probably not too important to find. Yeah. The battle started on the 30th of April 1982. The Iraqis have the 5th Mechanised Division defending and 5 brigades and some supporting units. They are then assaulted by human waves of Pasdaran troops. They continued the attacks until the 3rd of May 1982, but suffered large losses, something like 10,000 Iranians for 500 Iraqis. I'm not sure it was that one, but the losses, and in the report, I mean, in a Western report, they might be more, say, quantitative in their analysis. They might say, well, 10,000 troops lost, and 500 tanks, and 600 vehicles, and etc. etc. The book I read, it's basically stated that the Iranian report stated that the air of the battlefield was holy. You could sense the holy nature of the it could not be escaped. One could not escape the holy atmosphere of the battlefield. Something like that. It might not be the word holy, but it was very sort of, you got a feeling that he was talking about how it felt there. And that's something to do, that's not something to do with morale, but that is pretty much the same sort of level on how morale is calculated. It probably felt pretty dire, and people's emotions and psyches would have been in tune with that environment, and I think that's sort of touching on this sort of, the greater level of morale, whereas, the sense of victory would have possibly felt quite different. So anyway, the spirit and other morale qualities of an army, a general, or a government, the temper of the population, and the theatre of war, the morale effects of victory or defeat, all these vary greatly. They can, moreover, influence our objective and situation in very different ways. Even that sentence there is quite clear and specific. Talking about the spirit and other moral qualities of an army. The spirit of an army, a general, the spirit of a general, the spirit of a government. I often quite say this about our Western governments. They don't really. You can almost say they don't have the spirit that would drive you forward. The leaders, they're not leaders that you would follow into war. Consequently, though, next to nothing can be said about these things in books. They can no more be omitted from the theory of the art of war than can any other components of war. To repeat, it is paltry philosophy if, in the old-fashioned way, one lays down rules and principles in total disregard of morale values. As soon as these appear, one regards them as exceptions, which gives them a certain scientific status, and thus makes them into rules. Or again, one may appeal to genius, which is above all rules, which amounts to admitting that rules are not only made for idiots, but are idiotic in themselves. And to be quite honest, this reading doesn't get much more exciting than that. I'm definitely going to read that paragraph out again, because it's definitely something that, I picked up, and I haven't even read this through yet. I just picked up from just reading little bits here and there, and it seems to be making sense. And that's one of the things about old written works. They made sense. And a lot of what we got these days doesn't make sense, and I think it's that difficulty in actually making sense and communicating sense that we're missing in modern work of any form. Even films and media and news reports, they just don't make sense. Whereas you can read something like this, written 200 years ago, that makes complete sense. You sort of think, wow, I'm not saying it's phenomenally astounding. It just, for me, in this instance, sort of thinking, perhaps that second paragraph wasn't particularly insightful. It's just a boring splodge of text. I'm just reading parrot fashion over the internet, just to create videos, or do I feel there's something really worthwhile here? And certainly, this is it. And I'm going to read it again, just so that I can reflect on it. Consequently, though, next to nothing can be said about these things in books. They can no more be omitted from the theory of the art of war than can any other components of war. To repeat, it's paltry philosophy if, in the old-fashioned way, one lays down rules and principles in total disregard of moral values. As soon as these appear, one regards them as exceptions, which gives them a certain scientific status, and thus makes them into rules. Or again, one may appeal to genius, which is above all rules, which amounts to admitting that rules are not only made for idiots, but are idiotic in themselves. Now, with regards to morale, it's something that, as I said, I have already applied in the games that I run, in the sense that they have depression factors, as I've described already, which are designed to reduce the effectiveness of a unit. So if you're at depression, if you've got a depression factor of 1, that's equivalent of 10% loss. So this unit, which is at a 13, he would be, if he was a depression 1, he would be at 11.7, which is 13 minus 1.3. And so his strength and his defence and all factors, essentially, not movement, but strength and defence, are directly proportional to his depression level. You know, I'm not going to go into the actual rules, but further than that, at 5 depression factors, they then have to start calculating against morale. So if they reach depression level 6, there's a 10% chance that they might rout. And if you watch the videos, you know, units rout, and so it's quite often worthwhile just pounding air strikes and artillery against units that have got high depressions, because they have to roll every time they get attacked by artillery, and they could rout. And it's quite easy, it's quite a significant strategy to use to sort of just try and get rid of units that by forcing them to rout, or pushing them so that you know, they run the risk of routing. And I think the whole concept of routing is quite is quite important in games. And the only thing I would say about the way Warblog works with regards to that, it's not central to how it works. It's sort of like secondary, supplementary to, you know, the moving of units. And the reason that it's sort of secondary and supplementary is because it's not immediately apparent. And I have tried to sort of keep it so that you can, everything you can see. Well, you can't really see much. I mean, you can put your mouse over these units and you can see their depression factors, but you have to put your mouse over. You can't really see it. So I'm really trying to keep everything more visual. But obviously, the depression factors, like, you know, they could be just construed as hit points, and the effect of morale on routing is just something that happens. And if they fail the morale, you get a little message that says morale failed, and you see them running away. But you know, to sort of say, well, I mean, he starts off his chapter saying that you know, morale elements are among the most important in war. You sort of say, well, how does that work? Now, I have thought of doing an overall morale thing. So up here, it'd be like a, you know, there would be underneath the Battle of Azaz, there would be a bar. It said Iraqi morale, Iranian morale, and you know, both of them would start off at maybe 100, but one might start off at less, and you would have overall morale of the battlefield morale. And I have actually thought of that, and that's what this is sort of more in line with. So you could have units that are perfectly fit, perfectly healthy, but because you've lost lots of objectives, or because you haven't achieved your objectives, your army morale has gone down, and play things that way. And that is definitely something that I might think of for the future, but at the same time I don't want to make it so complex that anyone that's new to this sort of game would not know what it meant, and then would say, well, I had 3, but when I attacked I didn't have 3, and then, you know, they didn't realise that the bar up here is a lot lower. And the other consideration would be actually making that so that it worked not just for this battle, but for any other battle. You know, I mean, the morale situation in... I'm just trying to find something that's got almost nothing in it. Sod's law, you go looking for them. I mean, for example, the morale situation here might be quite difficult to do because there's not a lot of units. You know how to define what their overall morale is. But anyway, I'm not going to worry too much about that. Just read on. And I particularly like that last section. Or again, one may appeal to genius. And the concept of genius is something that I am quite interested in because, you know, I often think that I am a genius myself. And I say that with a degree of humility and humour. Because the concept of genius, I think is sort of overstated in the sense that people think, oh, genius must be something super genius. Well, genius is just like a person that's strong, in my sense. That's how I've always viewed it. And there are a lot of genius that are lost. People that are actually, not so much intelligence, because I don't think it is that, but it's a combination of skills that mean that you have the ability to engage in things intellectually and intelligently that other people might not. In the same way that a strong person could lift a log. Now, if that strong person never gets to lift the log, they never get to demonstrate or utilise their strength, and they might as well have not been strong. And similarly, if an intelligent person with the suitable skills that complement the approach to genius, such as the ability to apply that maybe in art, for example, or in writing, or in academia, or in war, as a commander, etc. Genius is just a person that has certain attributes, and being able to apply those, and I consider myself to be intelligent, and based on that, with the ability to I'm not talking about this site, but just generally through the past, sort of think, well, things I can do, border on what you might expect from genius, and I don't want to talk too much about myself on that, because I mean it's not a crime to maybe aspire or hope towards genius. It doesn't mean I am. I'm certainly not saying I am. But the thing is, he's using that word, or again, one may appeal to genius, which is above all the rules, which amounts to admitting that rules are not only made for idiots, but are idiotic in themselves. I'm not going to dwell on that last line, but that is just gold. Admitting that the rules are not only made, because a lot of war games have huge amounts of rules, and I couldn't agree more that they are made for idiots and are idiotic in themselves. And I do try to appeal to people to engage in a bit of role play, to sort of, it's instead of saying, this particular instance has happened here, you just role play it, and sort of you can sort of say, well, okay, let's just go into, I don't know, into this one here. We can sort of say, well, once we've got this place here, they're going to run away. You don't have to have special rules just to implement that, or we don't want to go past this line because I don't know, for some silly reason. I don't know what I'm talking about. Okay, in the theory of war, if the theory of war did no more than remind us of these elements, demonstrating the need to reckon with and give full value to morale qualities, it would expand its horizons, and simply by establishing this point of view would condemn in advance anyone who sought to base an analysis on material factors alone. I don't know what that means. Anyway, another reason for not placing morale factors beyond the scope of theory is their relation to all other so-called rules. The effects of physical and psychological factors form an organic whole which, unlike a metal alloy, is inseparable by chemical processes. In formulating any rule concerning physical factors, the theorist must bear in mind the part that moral factors may play in it. Otherwise he may be misled into making categorical statements that will be too timid and restricted, or else too sweeping and dogmatic. Even the most uninspired theories have involuntarily had to stray into the area of intangibles. For instance, one cannot explain the effects of a victory without taking psychological reactions into account. Hence, most of the matters dealt with in this book are composed on equal parts of physical and moral causes and effects. One might say that the physical seem little more than the wooden hilt, while the morale factors are the precious metal, the real weapon, the finely honed blade. History provides the strongest proof of the importance of morale factors and their often incredible effect. This is the noblest and most solid nourishment that the mind of a general may draw from a study of the past. Parenthetically, it should be noted that the seeds of wisdom that are to bear fruit in the intellect are sown less by critical studies and learned monographs than by insights, broad impressions, and flashes of intuition. We might list the most important morale phenomena in war. Like a diligent professor, try to evaluate them one by one. This method, however, all too easily leads to platitudes, while the genuine spirit of inquiry soon evaporates, and unwittingly we find ourselves proclaiming what everybody already knows. For this reason we prefer, even more than elsewhere, to treat the subject in an incomplete and impressionistic manner, content to have pointed out its general importance and to have indicated the spirit in which the argument of this book are conceived. I mean, this is all pretty sort of good stuff from my point of view. You know, you're just talking again about. I'll read those 2 paragraphs again slowly. History provides the strongest proof of the importance of morale factors and their often incredible effect. You know, so to some extent, he's saying that morale is, you know, one of the most important factors. And to be quite honest, I'm sort of thinking, well, how can I apply morale here? You know, I mean, what happens if their morale was so great that they actually were doubled in combat? You know, would that be something that we could then sort of say, well, war is really more about improving morale? You know, and to be quite honest, I have subliminally been doing just that. For example, in many of these battles, let's just pick up this one here. You know, you sort of say, well, there's more units or they're stronger. I mean, for example, in this one, there's a lot of troops here. There's about, I think there's about 3,000, and here there's only 1,000. But what I've done here, you can see, I've given them 4, 5, 3, and they're only companies. But that's if you know anything about the game, they're pretty strong for companies, and these are pretty strong, but they're not as high as these. So these are defending in 5s, and these are only attacking at 3s. They're almost doubled. There's 2 reasons for that. Is because basically these people won, so the MPLA, they won this battle. But it was also not so much to do with what we were talking about there, the importance of moral factors. But if a side wins, or the side, you know, had what we would see, what we would maybe be considering to constitute the morale, a high morale factor, as defined by this reading, I quite often reflect that in the units on the table, which is what I've had done here. I mean, you know, they had. I don't want to say it's just the morale, but they're a much smaller force, but they were much better at fighting. And so instead of giving them morale bonuses or instigating things, they just got heftier factors that you can see right in front of you. And whilst this is maybe not the best example, I have done that time and time again. For example, when in a lot of the Middle East scenarios that are current at the moment, you know, the militants and the ISIS units quite often have quite high factors and quite large numbers. You sort of think, well, why is that? Well, this reflects the sort of their relative morale, you know, in the sense that I'm not saying they're obviously feeling good, but they're highly motivated and fanatical, and that is reflected in sort of, you know, instead of bringing on board an extra dimension, I've just reflected that in their physical construct by giving them more units. So, for example, in this one, although this is Hayat, I can never remember who they are actually, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, you must think, well, they don't have that many. Well, you know, okay, well, these might actually just be little platoons. But a lot of what we got here is a reflection of the overall, which includes this sort of spiritual morale factor that is immeasurable, but in this case of the most important. And quite often that will be reflected by a downscaling in, say, the Syrian army, who have obviously the tanks and the artillery and all the hardware, but their units have been sort of downgraded a bit, not because they have poor morale, but you know that the spirit is lesser, or they're fighting against, you know, an opponent with a greater spirit, etc., etc. So you know. So history provides the strongest proof of the importance of morale factors and their often incredible effect. This is the noblest and most solid nourishment of that the mind of a general may draw from the study of the past. So, I mean, if you were a general, and there are generals, I mean, you know, what would you be thinking? Would you be thinking, well, I mean, how much do they contemplate how to raise the morale of their troops? And in a mechanized environment and mechanized war, how important actually is that? I mean, you know, how high do you have to raise the spirit, the morale of a drone pilot, of an A-10 bomber pilot, of the person that controls of a cruise missile, the people that, you know, controlling, you know, long-range howitzers, artillery, and rockets? These people are not at the front lines, and so it's, you know, it's not as relevant, etc., etc. But you know, again, here you might be the commander of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, you know, and I think, you know, they're quite often or was it call on their martyrdom and the life after death. And I mean, they're obviously doing things and obviously engaging in a way of life that essentially enhances their spirit and their morale in combat, so much so that they still haven't given up today. They're still fighting after whatever many years it is in Syria and Iraq. They're still fighting, and I think a lot of Western nations might have become jaded and given up. I mean, a lot of the civilians, I imagine, are tired of the war, but these people, they haven't given up, and you sort of think, what part of that? I mean, there's nothing left of them, and yet their spirit is still so strong that they're still there. I don't want to maybe say anything too controversial in all of that, but in the context of this word, there's got to be some depth there, and some sort of commentary or analysis that can be drawn from that. Which is why I cover the battles. I mean, there's no beating about the bush on that. Parenthetically, it should be noted that the seeds of wisdom that are to bear fruit in the intellect are sown by less critical studies and learned monographs than by insights, broad impressions, and flashes of intuition. And again, that's one of the things that drives me in Warblog. I've always sort of known that, and I'm not saying it's special about Warblog, but a lot of these games, they just go to such depth in creating a rule for everything, and methods and processes and reasons. Whereas, you can just throw all that away and say, well, okay, this is a sand map. You could almost just draw these in the map and put these as little shells, and these are sticks and bits of stone, and you can move them around, and this is a bit of seaweed or a bit of grass that you're using to represent this hill or whatever. And it's what you're looking for, or what it describes here as insights, broad impressions, and flashes of intuition. I mean, for example, I started off this monologue with my own flash of intuition I had yesterday about the difference between being highly depressed and highly motivated, and how that would affect you on just doing something like going outside for a run. And I had that flash of intuition, and this is what these little games are designed to do, to give you these sort of broad impressions, the insights and flashes of intuition, as opposed to creating extensive, there's nothing there. It just says what's happened. There's no extensive monograph or critical study into what's happening, because you do that in your mind. All a monograph is, or an extensive study is a padded out train of thought. That can be digested by someone else at a later time. But so I don't want to be too sort of narcissistic with sort of my analysis of things, but I'm just enjoying this, this whole sort of perspective on strategy. This works of someone that's 200 years old, and thinking, well, how does this apply to what this is? So it is sort of reflective, really. So we might list the most important morale phenomena in war, like a diligent professor, try to evaluate them one by one. This method, however, all too easily leads to platitudes, whilst the general spirit of inquiry soon evaporates, and unwittingly we find ourselves proclaiming what everybody already knows. And so again, it's really more a rhetorical repetition of sort of what has already been sort of based in this paragraph. But we can't just sort of say this is morale. Okay, well, how can we increase the morale? Well, let's give them all a pay rise. Well, okay, well, maybe that will do. But I think the spirit of things is to some extent far deeper rooted. I mean, for example, you could have people that are so spiritually driven and thinking about things like the Russian resistance, World War II, Stalingrad, the camaraderie. I mean, they weren't being given pay rises. I mean, what was it that drove these people to this sort of higher spirituality? Not so much spirituality, but this state of mind that wanted to, where they wanted to continue fighting. And I think to some extent, and this isn't an insight, but it was a vague insight that I had, is that once you start losing people, you see people dying, or you lose your loved ones or your family and your life and your way of life, I think your mindset will change quite considerably. And this was not so much an insight, just sort of a vague semi-insight, because I sort of half know it, but I imagine that will probably have a little bit to do with things as well. So from a commanding point of view, you might say, well, we don't want to beat them too much, because that will just that would just entrench their beliefs. And I think this is well known, maybe adroitly referred to in general, but you know, I mean, if what's been happening in Syria and Iraq, people have lost their homes, and they really have nothing else to do, and they want to fight, whether it's for one side or another, you know, for all sorts of reasons, and so these are things that can, you know, all sort of come into that. So it's not just about giving someone a pay rise to increase their morale, or getting some Playboy models to come in on a helicopter and to sort of dance around on a platform like they did in Vietnam. You know, I don't know. It's and I'm pretty sure that commanders in the field would have a much clearer understanding of how that all works. And I've never really been at the front line, but I think you know, if you start to think about it, you could sort of say, well, you know, it's got to be similar to, you know, the atmosphere that you might find at a football match, you know, with thousands of people all, you know, sort of rooting for one side or the other. You know, there's almost a tangible atmosphere, and you know, things like that. And so I think there's got to be a lot of thought on how morale works. But as I said, there's not a lot of scope for it in Warblog, other than the depression factors and you know, the principle of routing, essentially, just to sort of, you know, reiterate, I think, you know, where it is missing, it should be restored or applied in roleplay. If you think that, you know, by taking these units here, your morale will be broke. You will break the morale of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham units. Then do it. Make them run away. But you could equally well say that if the Syrian army doesn't win on the first battle here, its morale is broken and it doesn't want to do it again. Well, you have to wait 2 turns before you do it again, because, you know, the people that don't want to be losing, or that, you know, even just a slight loss is too much. I'm not saying that is the case, but I'm saying you can add that sort of role play in if you want, and if you're trying to sort of think about how the spirit works. You just embrace the spirit in your own mind, and you know, and quantify it in that way. So for this reason, we prefer here, even more than elsewhere, to treat the subject in an incomplete and impressionistic manner, content to have pointed out its general importance and to have indicated the spirit in which the argument this book, the argument, I think it should say the arguments of this book are conceived. And that's pretty much it. I'm not going to go too much further into that. The next chapter is actually called the Principal Morale Elements, and it's only 1 page long, and I could do it now, but I'm not going to, because I really want to keep the sections as they are. I'm interested to see how different that chapter will be in regards to. I can see a word that would probably be quite ideal to say now, but I'm going to leave it till that video. But yeah, I'm sort of quite interested to see what would that cover that I haven't already sort of like wibbled on about in this sort of monologue. You know, it sounds as though it's going to be the same, but I suspect that we'll see something different come out of that next chapter to make it worth listening to. So stay tuned, and I will get that done maybe later today or sometime.